is CBS News coverage of the presidential inauguration. This portion is sponsored by General Motors. Extra time, extra effort, and attention to every detail. GM is committed to excellence. And by Sun Company, where there's sun, there's energy. And now, from the East Building of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., here is Dan Rather.
Good morning. It is frostbite red, snow white, and ice cold blue here in flash frozen Washington. Record bitter cold. At last report, 2 degrees. It got down as low as 4 degrees overnight. 2 degrees at our last report. Minus 10 degrees at this hour when you figure in the considerable wind chill factor. So cold that for the first time in 152 years, the inaugural parade has been canceled entirely. So cold that for only the second time this century, the oath of office, actually a repeat of the official oath taken yesterday, will be taken by Ronald Reagan today, not outside on the west front of the Capitol as had been originally scheduled, but indoors, inside the Capitol Rotunda. But there's more to it than just an instant replay of yesterday's private oath-taking ceremony. President Reagan will deliver his inaugural address, and later in the day, an indoor, much abbreviated, what is being called inaugural tribute, will be held under the roof of the Capitol Center, where thousands of disappointed paraders can see and be seen by President and Nancy Reagan. Joining me here this morning from our vantage point in the East Building of the National Gallery are my colleagues Bob Schieffer and Bruce Morton. Bruce, it just doesn't get any colder than this in Washington. The all-time record was, 15 degrees below zero in the last century, but there's never been a colder January 21st.
There's never been a colder inauguration. John Kennedy's was cold. Ulysses S. Grant's second one was the one everybody talks about. The heat failed at the inaugural ball. Food froze, drink froze. 300 canaries who were supposed to warble sweetly froze to death. And the guests had danced in overcoats. And this is colder than that.
Well, the canary story is a good story. We will hope to get to that a little later on in the day.
I can't recall, man, when it's ever been colder in Washington, let alone on an inaugural day. And I've lived here for a long time. Someone told me this morning who had come here in 1968 to demonstrate against the war in Vietnam at Richard Nixon inaugural in 1969. They said if it had been this cold that year, I would have been for the war. It's cold.
Well, though there are no inaugural paraders and no parade watchers, the President and Mrs. Reagan will soon be motoring their way from the White House to the indoor Capitol ceremonies just across the way from our spectacular vantage point here in the East Building of the National Gallery of Art, where you can almost see frostbitten Phil Jones. Phil?
Dan, I don't know what all this fuss is about. I'm here. It's the sun is shining. You're talking about 2 degrees. A little bit of warm coming from the television lights, and there's really no problem. 3 pairs of socks, ski boots, thermal underwear, and a couple of coats, and you could make it through this inaugural day without any problem. They don't need to be inside. This is probably going to be a day where nobody is happy. If they were out here, they'd all be complaining about it being too cold. They're going to be inside the rotunda where it's going to be gridlock, people just crammed in there, and it'll probably be too hot, too cold. But what a difference 4 years makes. I can remember standing here just 4 years ago, a balmy 50 degrees as the inaugural ceremony occurred. But inside today, it's going to be different. And I've looked out here, and I don't see anybody around just in case they might change their mind and decide to come out here. Everybody got the message, and all these seats that people were fighting over just a few weeks ago and a few days ago are empty. Nobody around except a few technicians who are starting to break down after all of the effort of putting in the gear here on the west front of the Capitol. Dan?
Well, Phil, everyone's disappointed it won't be held outside, but it's a beautiful view in the rotunda of the Capitol, which we'll be seeing after a while. Right at the moment, the president's motorcade is forming up at the White House, and there is our White House correspondent, Bill Plant. Bill?
Good morning, Dan. The president is about to leave, and he and Mrs. Reagan are described to us this morning as very disappointed at the cancellation of the inaugural parade. And it was explained that they had to do this for medical reasons. They were warned, we were told by the White House spokesman, by medical folks, that people, all these youngsters in the bands, would suffer frostbite after about 5 minutes out in this kind of weather, all the exposed skin areas. So while the Reagans acceded in the cancellation of the parade, we're told that they did so very reluctantly. Nonetheless, it's a happy day for the president, and I think that you'll find that that upbeat mood will be mirrored in the address that he gives just a little later on after his second swearing in down at the Capitol Rotunda, Dan.
Well, Bill, we'll be following the president's motorcade as it goes from the White House to the Capitol once the motorcade officially forms up and the president and Mrs. Reagan enter into it. For those of you who've just joined us, and also to put this in some perspective, let's review the picture and what's going to happen as opposed to what had been planned to happen. As far as the ceremonies this morning, the only change, as the President and Mrs. Reagan dressed in blue, now are leaving the White House. The only change is that the ceremony for this morning has been moved indoors. Bill Plant, if you're still there and with us, the Mrs. Reagan dressed in blue coat and blue hat, done in blue for the day, and they're entering the limousine now for the, maybe 10-15-minute ride to the Capitol.
Well, at the speed that they'll go, Dan, it'll probably take just under 10 minutes. I think they'll move along. You know, there are not very many people, as I'm sure you yourself noticed, on the streets on this cold day in Washington. There are not a lot of spectators. Maybe they're one deep in places.
The presidential limousine, especially protected, of course, both on the bottom of the automobile as well as with bullet-resistant glass. And perhaps you can hear the whir of a helicopter overhead.
You know,
yes, Bill.
Dan, that's the one of the new limousines, the newest of the lot. They call it the talking car. The president has a PA microphone inside. He can ride along and talk to the people outside. It's really a rather amusing thing to see. This car will be going by, and if you can't see inside of it, you'll hear this fellow saying, "Well, hi, how are you?"
Presidents always like to use that. President Lyndon Johnson had one on his limousine, and he used to be fond of saying, "Hi, this is your president speaking to you." Beautiful scene of the White House. While it's bitterly cold here today, it makes the air so clear that everything stands out so vividly.
Absolutely crystalline, Dan.
And the presidential motorcade is underway from the White House to the Capitol. Perhaps you can see now those empty stands in the background. That's where the president would have been reviewing the parade this afternoon had the parade not been canceled.
It might be worth noting here, Dan, that the motorcade is leaving through the northeast gate, something that rarely happens. When the president goes to and from the White House, he usually departs from the diplomatic entrance on the south side of the mansion. So we don't see this very often.
Well, Bob Schieffer, you were our White House correspondent for a long time. I would think that what they did was use the northeast gate of the White House because we give the president the shortest walk from a White House door to the limousine. And in this kind of cold, quite understandably, everybody keeps their walking time in the open as short as possible.
Yes, you know, Dan, watching this, one of the things that makes a second inauguration so different from a first inauguration is that normally this trip from the White House, the president who is leaving the White House and the new president who is about to be sworn in ride together down Pennsylvania Avenue in one car. I've always thought that must be one of the most stilted situations that a person could find himself in, especially if the two men had just run against each other in an election. For example, when Ronald Reagan rode to the White House in the car with the Carters, you know, there'd been a lot of animosity during that campaign, and then there'd been a report, totally unsubstantiated, that Mrs. Reagan wanted the Carters to move out of the White House early so she could begin redecoration. It must be a tough conversational business.
For us reporters, though, I think added interest, you know, seeing the loser there. The poignancy of Lyndon Johnson, for instance, so battered by the Vietnam War that he couldn't even run for re-election. Kennedy and Eisenhower, two other men who didn't like each other very much, as it turned out. There's a harmony, obviously, to today, but you miss that drama of victor and vanquished.
What you don't miss is Bob, is the sense that this is America. After all, this is not the Soviet Union or someplace in Asia or South America. And among the sights and sounds, you hear the distant sounds of demonstrators. We have some here outside the East Building of the National Gallery of Art. You may have heard in the background. Frankly, I don't see how you could have avoided hearing this small group of demonstrators, and it is a very small group. They are protesting the United States' involvement in Central America and Nicaragua specifically. As the presidential motorcade makes its way from the White House to the Capitol for today's swearing in, We'll have more CBS News coverage of the inauguration in a moment. The presidential motorcade from the White House to the Capitol is nearing the Capitol itself. The president will enter at the Law Library entrance to the Capitol, and at the Law Library entrance is Meredith Vieira. Good morning, Meredith.
Good morning, Dan. I sort of agree with Phil Jones. It seems like a very nice, comfortable day from where I'm standing, waiting for the president to arrive. The honor guard is already outside here, also waiting for him. Obviously, he is disappointed. He had hoped that there would be 140,000 people here to see him be sworn in, and there are only about 1,000, we are told. Many of the dignitaries have come in through this law library door this morning. We see now police arriving on motorcycles, first car, and here is the president arriving now, Dan. I trust you can see this.
Well, indeed, Meredith, and we have some absolutely beautiful shots of the Capitol Dome, the president's automobile arriving. This is at on the east side of the Capitol, where some of the swearing-in ceremonies have been held. In fact, most of them previously. The president's limousine arriving right at the Law Library door. Meredith?
With the president should be Senator Charles Mathias, whose job it was to organize this swearing-in ceremony. He was here yesterday practicing with some of the choir members. They couldn't even sing, it was so cold, and he had to finally... stepping out right now is Congressman Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House. This may well be his last inauguration as a congressman. He has announced that in 2 years he will retire. Again, that is the Presidential Honor Guard. There is Mrs. Reagan and the president being greeted. The name Law Library Door is purely ceremonial. There used to be a law library here when the Supreme Court was housed in the Capitol, but that was many years ago. They are now being escorted inside the building, where they will go to a waiting room, a holding room. Originally from there, the plan had been to escort the president outside to the west front of the Capitol, but obviously that has been changed. Instead, we are told he will go by elevator up to the rotunda.
The president has come from the outside to the inside of the building now. And for those of you who know the Capitol, this is at the ground level, on the east side, the main side of the Capitol. Walking past some statues there, statues to one American who had to be carried on his deathbed to sign the Declaration of Independence, another American who invented ether. Little statues in the hallway, and now they go into this room, this little holding room. And Bob Schieffer, it was you, I believe, telling me that this holding room was actually constructed for this purpose.
Just for this purpose. It was done back in the 60s when they were doing some remodeling on the Capitol, and they built this room just so when the president comes up from the White House for his inauguration, he has a place to wait to get set before he makes his appearance. For people who have come to Washington as tourists and visited the Capitol, this is very near the old Supreme Court, the original Supreme Court chamber. And when the president came in the Law Library door, had he turned right, he would have gone into the old Supreme Court chamber, which, by the way, those old justices, Bruce and Dan, would have felt very much at home. It was very cold in that part of the Capitol during the winter. And one of the things that the clerk of the court used to do, he would look out the window. The Chief Justice would ask him, how's the weather? If he said cold, then the Chief Justice would say, break out the Madeira. And that's how they steel themselves against the cold.
This whole thing it's the new part of the Capitol. They redid the East Front back in the 60s. It was in disrepair as the West Front, where President Reagan was to speak, is now. They redid it in marble. They built a lot of little hideaway offices for senators and congressmen. Those are great prizes on Capitol Hill. And this room, if you're a tourist and you bought postcards, you were right here. The postcard counter is just a few feet from where our camera's pointed. Right
I was just going to say that it's a wonderful scene down there. Frankly, you have these statues of great Americans of the past, our ancient heroes, and then, of course, there is the curio stand just across the way where you can buy a postcard to send back to grandmother. Well, it may be too cold for the parade watchers, but it isn't too cold for Andy Rooney, who is out along the route of the parade that didn't happen. Good morning, Andrew.
Hi, Dan. I suppose I'm supposed to be funny here. Actually, I see very little funny down here on Pennsylvania where I am. I've been listening to television myself most of the morning, and I just don't want to get into the funny remarks with the amateurs. I've heard a lot of talk about the wind chill factor. Actually, you know, wind chill factor is something that was invented by television weathermen to make the weather sound more interesting than it is. Believe me, this weather is plenty interesting as it is without talking about the wind chill factor. I've here on Pennsylvania Avenue. Actually, Dan, Pennsylvania Avenue, most of it is a pretty dull street. If I was a Pennsylvanian, I wouldn't mind having it called Delaware Avenue or Arkansas Avenue or something different. I'm looking at some dull government building, and there's a statue of Casimir Pulaski over there, a Polish general, but I didn't know him personally. And I haven't seen a lot very interesting. President Reagan just went by, and I think he likes me because he waved at me, or I think it was him waving. It might have been a Secret Service man, I'm not sure. Matter of fact, I'm not even sure which car he was in. But actually, I've talked to some of the paraders at the hotels, the kids who were going to march, and they're the ones who were disappointed. I don't think anybody who was going to watch is that disappointed. And that's what's happened with parades in America. Parades are mostly for the people marching in them. There are always more marchers than watchers at a parade. So this is pretty much a typical crowd in New York City, Dan.
Well, Andrew, tell me the truth now. Honest Andrew, aren't you disappointed the parade didn't come off?
I personally am not disappointed, and I'll tell you why. I got all those books that we were supposed to study, Dan, about the floats that were going by and everything, and I never got to study them. And I thought I was going to stand up here and make a fool of myself because I wouldn't know what floats were going by. And I kept putting it off and putting it off because I was thinking that was more of Miss America's kind of a job than the kind of a job I do. And I never did get to study what was going to go by me. So when the thing was canceled, I was just delighted, Dan.
Well, an awful lot of young Americans with broken hearts over the whole thing. Andrew, we'll be coming back to you, we hope, a little bit later on. Also watching the inaugural ceremonies with us today is my colleague Bill Moyers, who's in our Washington studios, our CBS News studios here, with some distinguished guests. Bill, good morning.
Good frigid morning, Dan. I have with me here Dr. William Leuchtenberg, notable historian, University of North Carolina, author of many fine books on American history, and Barbara Kellerman, who's a political scientist at the Institute for Leadership Studies at Fairleigh Dickens University in New Jersey, who's just written a book about presidential leadership. Dr. Kellerman, of all the presidents you've studied, what is unique about Ronald Reagan's leadership?
I would say that Ronald Reagan has the singular capacity for being a strong leader and yet doing it in such a way that it feels almost painless to those people who are being led.
What is that talent? I mean, how does he do it?
It's partly his manner. It's a stylistic thing. It's partly that he delegates very generously and therefore appears not to be the one to be manipulating others. But in total, it's a style that is particularly suited to a culture in which people generally resist being led. So the idea of having, on the one hand, a strong leader, and on the other hand, appearing to do it in such a way that does not impose his will on those who can be described as his followers, is in fact a singularly adroit combination for the American political culture.
He has been very fond of comparing himself, Dr. Leuchtenberg, to one of your figures, one of the major figures about whom you've written, Franklin Roosevelt. Ronald Reagan has told us time and time again that he was following in Roosevelt's footsteps. Is his leadership of Roosevelt's kind?
Well, I'm sure that he believes that, and he does have ties to FDR. He often says that he voted for FDR in 1932 when Roosevelt was in favor of balancing the budget, and he hasn't changed. It's the Democrats who've changed. In fact, Reagan voted for FDR all 4 times, and he once, in fact, described himself as having been a hemophilic liberal. As late as 1950, he backed Helen Gahagan Douglas against Richard Nixon. The Douglas people thought of making him honorary chairman, but they thought he had too left-wing a reputation. And this would hurt him.
Bill, we need to go back to Dan for a moment now.
Well, thank you, Bill. And I know it's cold when indoors you say Fairleigh Dickens University when you meant Fairleigh Dickinson University. I know you don't want to answer all that mail, and neither do I, so it is Fairleigh Dickinson University. President Reagan is in the Capitol in the holding room, and will be going soon to the indoor Capitol Rotunda for the swearing-in ceremony, and we'll have more CBS News coverage of the inauguration in a moment.
Watch the stars shine all week long on Entertainment Tonight and see Joan Rivers show off her right stuff.
Hello, Joan.
Next, Dynasty gets a piece of the rock, and Footloose star Kevin Bacon picks up the pace.
Then we'll make a wish and blow out those birthday candles with Paul Newman.
Plus, Philip Bailey's hit duet with Phil Collins.
It all starts off when you get down with the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin, on Entertainment Tonight.
If you're in the market for a little glamour, a lot of excitement, plenty of surprises, and the biggest payoff of any game show anywhere, you don't want to miss Sale of the Century. Weeknights at 6:30 right here on Channel 5.
CBS News coverage of the presidential inauguration continues. Here again is Dan Rather.
From the beautiful capital of the land of the free, Washington, D.C., where it's the coldest inauguration day on record, coldest inauguration day in history, 2 degrees below zero at last register. The official party is leaving the holding room in the capital of the United States and moving now toward the rotunda, where the swearing-in ceremonies will be held today. A decision because of the cold. They will not be held in the west front of the Capitol. They will be held in the rotunda. Mrs. Reagan and Mrs. Bush are now arriving in the rotunda area, and our Susan Spencer is there. Good morning, Susan.
Hey, Dan. Beginning to get warm. There are jammed into the rotunda right now. They had expected what they've done with it. As you can see, it's absolutely packed. There's really no room for anyone else. And since for about the last 5 minutes, stopped. And there's really, everyone is simply on pins and needles. You can sense an air of anticipation. I think several people have portable television sets because they couldn't see who was coming in, but when various of the dignitaries came in, spontaneous bursts of applause broke out.
Dan, I'll bet one of the people in this town who is not disappointed that this ceremony has been moved indoors is Susan Spencer, because
oh no,
Susan
Bob,
was standing out on the steps yesterday, and that's where she was supposed to have been today, and that's got to be a better deal.
I was absolutely prepared for that.
You know, Susan Spencer, Bob Schieffer, and Andy Rooney said before, well, he didn't like Pennsylvania Avenue. Vice President Bush entering the room now, but you know, there's some beautiful buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue, and the Capitol Rotunda, I'm going to go ahead and say it, is one of the most beautiful places in this or any other country. It's a beautiful, beautiful room.
I think today one of the most crowded places in the country, too. There's Mr. Reagan with Speaker O'Neill. Phil Jones was talking about gridlock, and I think the Rotunda has achieved it this morning.
President Reagan, flanked by Senator Mathias and Speaker O'Neill, moves toward the rotunda.
Two men that the president may have some difficulties with this year, Dan. They're all friendly today, but Senator Mathias, being a very liberal Republican, often opposes the president's programs. And Speaker O'Neill, of course, is the leader of the opposition in the House. Senator Mathias, by the way, is the chairman of the Capitol Inauguration Committee, is why he is part of the honor guard, as it were, today.
And not a bad phrasemaker. Mathias said when somebody asked him, well, any members of the public going to be in the rotunda for the swearing-in today? And he said, well, not unless they're very, very thin. Meaning that there's only room for special guests and VIPs in the rotunda. This is one of the disadvantages of having the swearing-in indoors, forced understandably by the weather.
Well, when you figure that they invited 140,000 people to the outdoor ceremony, and we're down to one, granted large, but still one room, you can see that this is a considerable squeeze.
Isn't it nice that for a change, because we're so used to seeing the result of tragedy when we see televised pictures of this rotunda, because this is where we have seen our great leaders lay in state, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson after he died, of course, to see a happy ceremony, which really is what an inauguration is.
Well, there have been persons honored by other ceremonies at the rotunda. It is true that our memories are of an assassinated president and memory from the history books of Lincoln being in state in the rotunda, but Admiral George Dewey was honored there, ruffles and flourishes, and to be followed by Hail to the Chief as the president enters the great Capitol rotunda.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Right
Reverend Timothy Healy
President, Mr. Vice President
of Georgetown University will give the invocation.
We celebrate today the 50th inauguration
This is Senator Mathias.
of a President and Vice President of the United States, and the beginning of a presidential term that brings us to the threshold of the 3rd century of American constitutional government. I will ask the Reverend Timothy S. Healy, President of Georgetown University, to offer the invocation.
Let us offer this prayer for the President and Vice President and their families, for the people and government of these United States, for men and women of goodwill everywhere, captive and free, who watch us today. Please join me in saying the words our Lord taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Miss Jessie Norman will now sing Simple Gifts, one of the songs in Aaron Copland's Old American Songs.
Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free, tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and delights. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round right. Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free, tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and delights. Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free, tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and
We might note that Senator Charles Mathias is serving as sort of master of ceremonies this morning because he is chairman of the Joint Congressional Inauguration Committee. You see Senator Mathias now helping to make the introductions.
I now ask Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk, President of Hebrew Union College of Cincinnati, to offer a prayer.
We, the people, turn to you, O God, in prayer. We have come again to this place which stirs our hearts to reaffirm the highest ideals of our nation. The sacred oaths about to be pronounced in your name reflect the awesome responsibilities entrusted to our President and Vice President by the American people. May you, who are the Rock of Ages, guide them in protecting the Constitution of our beloved Commonwealth, founded in faith, which ensures unity without uniformity. Sustain them, O God, as they advance the American way, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to malevolence no hope. O source of all life, enshrine in their hearts the knowledge that all are created in your image, and that life, your gift to us, is sacred. Inspire our leaders to defeat hunger and hurt, to promote compassion, and to find successful ways to assure the weak their share of America's promise. In humility we pray that this opportunity for renewal will advance reconciliation in the family of nations, guaranteeing peace in our world and tranquility in the farthest reaches of our universe. May those who follow us, our children and our children's children, bless our President and Vice President, their families and all those associated with them in government, and may all remember this time and this administration as that in which their future was made secure. O God, may you who makes peace in high places help us here on earth to find the way to peace. Blessed are you, O God, Oseh HaShalom, granter of peace. Amen.
Justice Potter Stewart will administer the oath of office to the Vice President.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I take this oath, this obligation freely.
That I take this obligation freely.
Without any mental reservation.
Without any mental reservation.
Or purpose of evasion.
Or purpose of evasion.
That I will well and faithfully discharge.
That I will well and faithfully discharge.
The duties of the office.
The duties of the office.
On which I am about to enter.
On which I am about to enter.
So help you God.
So help me God.
The University of Maryland Chorus, under the direction of Dr. Paul Traver, will now sing the first section of Randall Thompson's Testament of Freedom.
The text of this is based on the words of Thomas Jefferson, including the God who gave us life, gave us liberty at the same time.
I will now ask the President's own pastor the Reverend Don Mumaw of Bel Air Presbyterian Church to offer a prayer.
Let us all unite in prayer. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Come, Father, with cleansing power and remove all things from us that would impede your purpose and thwart your plan. Forgive our pride and arrogance before each other and other nations of the world. May we, with godly grace, weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who work for a just and free world. Grant us, O Father, the courage and the compassion to stand in solidarity with the poor, the needy, the dispossessed, and the disadvantaged. May the President and Vice President of these United States and all who stand with him in his desire for peace receive first the peace of Christ, and in all things seek first not the kingdom of plenty or the kingdom of political superiority, but may they seek humbly first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. In the name of the King, even Jesus Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen. Amen.
The Chief Justice will now administer the oath to the President.
President, are you ready to take the oath? You'll raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will to the best of my ability.
Will to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
My congratulations, sir.
Gun salute from outside the Capitol, President and Mrs. Reagan, inside the Capitol in the Capitol Rotunda. Vice President's official song, unofficial song, Hail Columbia, was played a little earlier.
Senator Mathias, Chief Justice Berger, Vice President Bush, Speaker O'Neill, Senator Dole, Reverend clergy, and members of my family and friends, and my fellow citizens, this day has been made brighter with the presence here of one who for a time has been absent, Senator John Stennis. God bless you and welcome back. There is, however, one who is not with us today. Representative Gillis Long of Louisiana left us last night, and I wonder if we could all join in a moment of silent prayer. Amen. There are no words adequate to express my thanks for the great honor that you've bestowed on me. I'll do my utmost to be deserving of your trust. This is, as Senator Mathias told us, the 50th time that we, the people, have celebrated this historic occasion. When the first president, George Washington, placed his hand upon the Bible, he stood less than a single day's journey by horseback from raw, untamed wilderness. There were 4 million Americans in a union of 13 states. Today, we are 60 times as many in a union of 50 states. We've lighted the world with our inventions, gone to the aid of mankind wherever in the world there was a cry for help, journeyed to the moon and safely returned. So much has changed, and yet we stand together as we did 2 centuries ago. When I took this oath 4 years ago, I did so in a time of economic stress. Voices were raised saying that we had to look to our past for the greatness and glory. But we, the present-day Americans, are not given to looking backward. In this blessed land, there is always a better tomorrow. 4 years ago, I spoke to you of a new beginning, and we have accomplished that. But in another sense, our new beginning is a continuation of that beginning created 2 centuries ago, when, for the first time in history, government, the people said, was not our master, it is our servant. Its only power, that which we, the people, allow it to have. That system has never failed us, but for a time we failed the system. We asked things of government that government was not equipped to give. We yielded authority to the national government that property belonged to states or to local governments or to the people themselves. We allowed taxes and inflation to rob us of our earnings and savings, and watched the great industrial machine that had made us the most productive people on earth slow down and the number of unemployed increase. By 1980, we knew it was time to renew our faith, to strive with all our strength toward the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with an orderly society. We believed then and now there are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams. And we were right. And we were right to believe that. Tax rates have been reduced, inflation cut dramatically, and more people are employed than ever before in our history. We are creating a nation once again, vibrant, robust, and alive. But there are many mountains yet to climb. We will not rest until every American enjoys the fullness of freedom, dignity, and opportunity as our birthright. It is our birthright as citizens of this great republic. And if we meet this challenge, these will be years when Americans have restored their confidence and tradition of progress, when our values of faith, family, work, and neighborhood were restated for a modern age, when our economy was finally freed from government's grip, when we made sincere efforts at meaningful arms reductions, and by rebuilding our defenses, our economy, and developing new technologies, helped preserve peace in a troubled world. When America courageously supported the struggle for individual liberty, self-government, and free enterprise throughout the world, and turned the tide of history away from totalitarian darkness and into the warm sunlight of human freedom. My fellow citizens, our nation is poised for greatness. We must do what we know is right and do it with all our might. Let history say of us, these were golden years when the American Revolution was reborn, when freedom gained new life and America reached for her best. Our two-party system has solved us and served us, I should say, well over the years, but never better than in those times of great challenge when we came together not as Democrats or Republicans, but as Americans united in a common cause. Two of our founding fathers, a Boston lawyer named Adams and a Virginia planter named Jefferson, members of that remarkable group who met in Independence Hall and dared to think they could start the world over again, left us an important lesson. They had become, in the years then in government, bitter political rivals in the presidential election of 1800. And then years later, when both were retired and age had softened their anger, they began to speak to each other again through letters. A bond was reestablished between those two who had helped create this government of ours. In 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, they both died. They died on the same day, within a few hours of each other, and that day was the 4th of July. In one of those letters exchanged in the sunset of their lives, Jefferson wrote, "It carries me back to the times when, beset with difficulties and dangers, we were fellow laborers in the same cause, struggling for what is most valuable to man, his right of self-government, laboring always at the same oar, with some wave ever ahead threatening to overwhelm us, and yet passing harmless, we rode through the storm with heart and hand." Well, with heart and hand, let us stand as one today. One people under God, determined that our future shall be worthy of our past. As we do, we must not repeat the well-intentioned errors of our past. We must never again abuse the trust of working men and women by sending their earnings on a futile chase after the spiraling demands of a bloated federal establishment. You elected us in 1980 to end this prescription for disaster, and I don't believe you re-elected us in 1984 to reverse course. At the heart of our efforts is one idea vindicated by 25 straight months of economic growth. Freedom and incentives unleash the drive and entrepreneurial genius that are the core of human progress. We have begun to increase the rewards for work, savings, and investment, reduce the increase in the cost and size of government and its interference in people's lives. We must simplify our tax system, make it more fair, and bring the rates down for all who work and earn. We must think anew and move with a new boldness so every American who seeks work can find work, so the least among us shall have an equal chance to achieve the greatest things, to be heroes who heal our sick, feed the hungry, protect peace among nations, and leave this world a better place. The time has come for a new American emancipation, a great national drive to tear down economic barriers and liberate the spirit of enterprise in the most distressed areas of our country. My friends, together we can do this, and do it we must, so help me God. From new freedom will spring new opportunities for growth, a more productive, fulfilled, and united people, and a stronger America. An America that will lead the technological revolution and also open its mind and heart and soul to the treasures of literature, music, and poetry, and the values of faith, courage, and love. A dynamic economy with more citizens working and paying taxes will be our strongest tool to bring down budget deficits. But an almost unbroken 50 years of deficit spending has finally brought us to a time of reckoning. We've come to a turning point, a moment for hard decisions. I have asked the cabinet and my staff a question, and now I put the same question to all of you. If not us, who? And if not now, when? It must be done by all of us. going forward with a program aimed at reaching a balanced budget, we can then begin reducing the national debt. I will shortly submit a budget to the Congress aimed at freezing government program spending for the next year. Beyond this, we must take further steps to permanently control government's power to tax and spend. We must act now to protect future generations from government's desire to spend its citizens' money and tax them into servitude when the bills come due. Let us make it unconstitutional for the federal government to spend more than the federal government takes in. We have already started returning to the people and to state and local governments responsibilities better handled by them. Now, there is a place for the federal government in matters of social compassion, but our fundamental goals must be to reduce dependency and upgrade the dignity of those who are infirm or disadvantaged. And here, a growing economy and support from family and community offer our best chance for a society where compassion is a way of life, where the old and infirm are cared for, the young and, yes, the unborn protected, and the unfortunate looked after and made self-sufficient. Now, there is another area where the federal government can play a part. As an older American, I remember a time when people of different race, creed, or ethnic origin in our land found hatred and prejudice installed in social custom and, yes, in law. There's no story more heartening in our history than the progress that we've made toward the brotherhood of man that God intended for us. Let us resolve there will be no turning back or hesitation on the road to an America rich in dignity and abundant with opportunity for all our citizens. Let us resolve that we, the people, will build an American opportunity society in which all of us, white and black, rich and poor, young and old, will go forward together, arm in arm. Again, let us remember that though our heritage is one of bloodlines from every corner of the earth, we are all Americans pledged to carry on this last best hope of man on earth. I've spoken of our domestic goals and the limitations we should put on our national government. Now let me turn to a task that is the primary responsibility of national government, the safety and security of our people. Today we utter no prayer more fervently than the ancient prayer for peace on earth. Yet history has shown that peace does not come, nor will our freedom be preserved by goodwill alone. There are those in the world who scorn our vision of human dignity and freedom. One nation, the Soviet Union, has conducted the greatest military buildup in the history of man, building arsenals of awesome offensive weapons. We've made progress in restoring our defense capability, but much remains to be done. There must be no wavering by us, nor any doubts by others, that America will meet her responsibilities to remain free, secure, and at peace. There is only one way safely and legitimately to reduce the cost of national security, and that is to reduce the need for it. And this we're trying to do in negotiations with the Soviet Union. We're not just discussing limits on a further increase of nuclear weapons. We seek instead to reduce their number. We seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Now, for decades, we and the Soviets have lived under the threat of mutual assured destruction. If either resorted to the use of nuclear weapons, the other could retaliate and destroy the one who had started it. Is there either logic or morality in believing that if one side threatens to kill tens of millions of our people, our only recourse is to threaten killing tens of millions of theirs? I have approved a research program to find, if we can, a security shield that will destroy nuclear missiles before they reach their target. It wouldn't kill people. It would destroy weapons. It wouldn't militarize space. It would help demilitarize the arsenals of Earth. It would render nuclear weapons obsolete. We will meet with the Soviets hoping that we can agree on a way to rid the world of the threat of nuclear destruction. We strive for peace and security, heartened by the changes all around us. Since the turn of the century, the number of democracies in the world has grown fourfold. Human freedom is on the march, and nowhere more so than in our own hemisphere. Freedom is one of the deepest and noblest aspirations of the human spirit. People worldwide hunger for the right of self-determination, for those inalienable rights that make for human dignity and progress. America must remain freedom's staunchest friend, for freedom is our best ally. And it is the world's only hope to conquer poverty and preserve peace. Every blow we inflict against poverty will be a blow against its dark allies of oppression and war. Every victory for human freedom will be a victory for world peace. So we go forward today, a nation still mighty in its youth and powerful in its purpose. With our alliances strengthened, with our economy leading the world to a new age of economic expansion, we look to a future rich in possibilities. And all of this is because we worked and acted together, not as members of political parties, but as Americans. My friends, we live in a world that's lit by lightning. So much is changing and will change, but so much endures and transcends time. History is a ribbon, always unfurling. History is a journey. And as we continue our journey, we think of those who traveled before us. We stand again at the steps of this symbol of our democracy, or we would have been standing at the steps if it hadn't gotten so cold. Now we're standing inside this symbol of our democracy. And we see and hear again the echoes of our past. A general falls to his knees in the hard snow of Valley Forge. A lonely president paces the darkened halls and ponders his struggle to preserve the Union. The men of the Alamo call out encouragement to each other. A settler pushes west and sings a song, and the song echoes out forever and fills the unknowing air. It is the American sound. It is hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That's our heritage. That's our song. We sing it still. For all our problems, our differences, we are together as of old. We raise our voices to the God who is the author of this most tender music. And may he continue to hold us close as we fill the world with our sound in unity, affection, and love. One people, under God, dedicated to the dream of freedom that he has placed in the human heart. Called upon now to pass that dream on to a waiting and a hopeful world. God bless you, and may God bless America. Thank you.
the second inaugural address of President Ronald Wilson Reagan.
I will ask the Reverend Peter Gomes, minister in the Memorial Church at Harvard University, to pronounce the benediction. Following the benediction, these proceedings will be concluded by the playing of the national anthem by the Marine Corps Band.
Let us pray. Almighty God, who hast given us this good land for our heritage, we humbly beseech thee that we may always prove ourselves a people mindful of thy favor and glad to do thy will. Bless our land with honorable industry, sound learning, and pure manners. Save us from discord, violence, and confusion, and the frailty of our own hearts. Defend our liberties, preserve our unity, and fashion into one united people the multitudes brought hither out of many kindreds and tongues. Endue with the spirit of wisdom, prudence, and fortitude the President and the Vice President of these United States, and all those to whom is entrusted the authority of government, to the end that justice and peace may flourish at home and abroad. Make us, with them, equal to our high trusts, reverent in the use of freedom, just in the exercise of power, generous in the protection of weakness. May wisdom and compassion be the stability of our times, and our deepest trust in thee, in whom we live and move and have our being. Unto thee, O Lord, we ascribe all honor and glory, and in thanksgiving and in hope, we commend now to thy eternal protection ourselves, our nation, and our world. Amen.
Hail to the Chief. The music is by James Sanderson to the words from the boat song in Sir Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake. President Chester Arthur thought Hail to the Chief lacked dignity, and at his request, John Philip Sousa composed other presidential music titled Presidential Polonaise, but that proved very difficult music to walk to, and it fell from grace, so we have Hail to the Chief. scene is the great Capitol Rotunda. The cornerstone for the Capitol building was laid in 1793 by then President George Washington. After the Masonic ceremony of that time, the crowd feasted on roast ox. Today, the president will be feasting on fish next door at the Statuary Hall, where he, Mrs. Reagan, Vice President Bush, Mrs. Bush, going now to a luncheon hosted by the members of the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. Moving from the rotunda to the Statuary Hall. President Reagan giving his second inaugural address. Bob Schieffer and Bruce Morton, the president described the American people as he has before, as a daring and decent people. He got the most applause when he called for a constitutional amendment for a balanced federal budget.
And there's some irony, I think, there, Dan. This is the president who accumulated the biggest budget deficits in history, speaking to the members of Congress who helped him. And everybody's cheering for the idea of a balanced budget amendment. The problem with that, of course, is that most of the proposed amendments have loopholes, and if these guys want to go on the way they're going, they'll find them.
I think this speech could be summed up quite simply, Dan. This was pure Reagan, pure Ronald Reagan. It's a speech he has made most of his political career, where he again took off the government, talked about freeing the citizens from the tyranny of government. That's been a theme as long as Ronald Reagan's been making speeches. And he promised more of the same.
Well, I think with a second-term president, you know what you're going to get. There isn't anything in this that would surprise a Reagan fan or a Reagan foe, for that matter. This is what got him elected 4 years ago, and clearly he needs to go on as he's been going.
So what do they call this? What's the phrase in this speech? Is it the new American emancipation? Is that what this speech will be known as?
There's a fair amount of flowery language in here. History is a ribbon. We live in a world lit by lightning. The speechwriters work hard.
But gentlemen, we'll have more analysis, commentary about the president's inaugural speech. But, you know, one of the things my personal opinion television does best is take people places. And here is in the Capitol Rotunda, the United States Marine Band, the second inauguration. Let's just listen and watch for at least a half minute here. And as the medley of service tunes continues from the Capitol Rotunda, our CBS News coverage of the inauguration will continue after these messages.
CBS News coverage of the presidential inauguration continues. From the East Building of the National Gallery of Art, here again is Dan Rather.
From the East Building of the National Gallery of Art, just in front of the west front of the Capitol, where the inaugural ceremonies of the day were to have been held, but because of inclement weather, the temperature, by the way, in Washington is up to 5 degrees, above zero at the moment. The swearing-in was held inside the Capitol itself. This was a replay of yesterday's swearing-in, the official one required by the Constitution at the White House. At the moment, the post-inaugural luncheon is being formed up in the Statuary Hall inside the Capitol. And while President and Mrs. Reagan and Vice President and Mrs. Bush are making their way there, let's call in Bill Plant, our White House correspondent. Bill, to talk just a little bit about the president's inaugural address. The president, it seems to me, was not trying to really spell out in any specific detail what he plans to do. He wanted to set a tone for his second term. But even having said that, it's clear that President Reagan at least begins his second term determined to go ahead with his agenda, basically the same agenda he had during the first term.
That's right, Dan. That's what he thinks the people elected him to do, and he's pointed more than once recently to the overwhelming vote that he got in November. And as you point out, this was a themed speech. The details will come later. There will be more details, for example, about what he wants in the way of tax reform in the State of the Union address at the beginning of February. In this speech, he made a point of talking, as he has for 20 years in political life and 40 years overall, of expressing his boundless optimism, the unity idea, the new beginning, the no limits to growth. That's the cornerstone of the Reagan philosophy. He thinks that all things are still possible, but without much government intervention. It's the unbounded optimism, less government. This speech should be a joy to conservatives, I would think, Dan, because he is talking about pushing ahead with his program. Again, no specifics, but that's the tone.
Phil Jones, our Capitol Hill correspondent, we're aware a president is many men, and when he makes something such as an inaugural address, he's speaking to many different constituencies and audiences, not the least of which is the United States Congress. How is today's inaugural address going to play in Congress, particularly, if we read it right, this determination to go ahead with his agenda and the emphasis on a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget?
Well, Dan, I think it's about what everybody expected here. All of his supporters would call it the stay the course speech, and probably his opponents would call it the stay the curse. I think that there weren't enough specifics in here today to where even his opponents can get too excited, but I think everybody is for tax simplification. He did not outline exactly what he wants to do in this area, and there are many members of Congress who have questions about tax simplification. It sounds good, but they're not sure just what they want to simplify. He also talked about a freeze of spending. There are many people up here who have questions about an overall across-the-board freeze. So that is not going to go through too easily. He also talked just briefly about his Star Wars program. There is some support up here for that, but there are still many questions. I think that overall it's going to be a pretty tough time for the president here as he begins his second term, primarily because the people up here are politicians too. And they know that he's a lame duck, that he doesn't have to worry about running again for office. But many of them are up 2 years from now and 4 years from now, and they're going to be looking out for their own political hides. So I think that there will be some tough times ahead, especially as the president tries to come up with some economic program. Many members of Congress here are saying that the president has to lead, but they're not so sure they want to follow just exactly where he's headed at this point.
Dan and Phil?
Yes.
You know, I think it should be emphasized here that Ronald Reagan plans to take his case to the people as much in a second term, if not more, than he did in the first. And he, I know, thinks that he can hold a threat over those senators and congressmen who are running for re-election in 1986. Go out and, in effect, threaten to campaign against them. He believes that he's got at least 2 good years where he can work his will still through the people on the Congress.
Well, I think that many people up here still fear him and his ability to go out and communicate and go over the heads of Congress. But I think realistically, the politicians up here, and especially the Republicans, many in the Senate who are up for re-election in 1986, are saying that the window of opportunity for this president to really accomplish something, to make some major changes in economic policy in this country, probably no more than 120 days or so. A very short period.
Well, Bill and Phil, I may, that this inaugural address, as with most of them, was not designed to spell out specifics. So while the president does make it clear that he's going to start the second term going after his agenda, what he was hoping to accomplish here, it seems to me, is, insofar as he was able to do so, is a kind of a tonal poem, if you will. Presidents have tried this before, and most of them have failed. We were a little early for reaction to this one, and can't give it historical context. That takes time. Lincoln's second inaugural address, probably the best known, the one that says, "With malice toward none and with charity for all." George Washington's second inaugural address, the shortest in history, only 135 words. I suspect that if this second inaugural address of Ronald Reagan's goes into the history books in any complimentary way, it may be the paragraph that says, "History is a ribbon, always unfurling. History is a journey, and as we continue our journey, we think of those who've traveled it before us. We stand again at the steps of this symbol of our democracy, and we see and hear again the echoes of our past. It is the American sound." Unquote President Ronald Reagan in his second inaugural address. Our CBS News coverage of the inauguration will continue in a moment. Well, they're assembling for the post-inaugural luncheon inside the Capitol back there, and I want to stop for a moment and explain to you something that may be happening. Our broadcast booth here is in the East Building of the National Gallery of Art, one of our new national treasures. And we came here as our broadcast place, for one thing, to give you this marvelous view, which you've seen this morning from time to time, through this window out onto the west front of the Capitol, where the original swearing-in was to have taken place. Now, what's happened in this bitter cold, a record cold of -4 degrees overnight in Washington, the temperature is now up to 7 above. We put this little thermometer in here to show you 7 above zero now in Washington, D.C. But in our little broadcast facility, despite all the technology, despite all the gimmicks and gadgets, we still have what you always have in the family car. When you get your wife and your mother-in-law and the kids in the car, the thing steams up. And that's what happens to this window back here. So if you have a feeling that something surrealistic was happening to you in the background, that this Capitol sort of came and went, it's not unlike what happens in your car when it fogs up. And I remember so well, once we bought an automobile, and the good and wise Gene Rather said we ought to take that extra option of getting the defogger for the back window. And I said, no, I'm not going to spend the money. And we spent years in that automobile with the back window fogging up. Well, this was not a case of a low-budget operation for CBS News. It was simply a case of the bitter cold today was nobody could have anticipated weather this cold. So that's the reason our view of the Capitol comes and goes in your consciousness and in your view.
Like Brigadoon.
A little Brigadoon, not bad at all. The post-inaugural luncheon forming up in the Capitol, the talk as it forms up there, and as the music in Statuary Hall plays in the background, a lot of the talk is about President Reagan's second inaugural address. That my colleague Bill Moyers, who's heard a few of these inaugural addresses, second and otherwise, listened with the rest of us. He is at our CBS News headquarters at 2020 M Street. And Bill, if this inaugural address is long remembered, for what may it be long remembered?
For being his second inaugural address. I really don't think there was much in it rhetorically that will stand the test of Bartlett's time. I think it was a suitable address for Ronald Reagan. It was typical Reagan, as someone said. I dearly love to watch the man when he speaks, Dan. It's like watching Houdini, except that instead of ropes and chains and saws and rabbits, he uses nostalgia, sentiment, and piety. And it's a wonderful act. It's a good act. It's one of the best political acts to come along in a long time. But it's also full of contradiction. Mr. Reagan talked about taming a bloated federal establishment, but the federal establishment is today larger than it was 4 years ago. He calls for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, which, if he'd had to labor under, would have handcuffed him so that he would not have been able to do what he's done the last 4 years.
Bill, pardon me for interrupting, but in your judgment, and I'm asking for a personal opinion here, is there any real viable chance of passing a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget?
Well, sufficient states have passed it to make it possible for it to be sent to Congress. If I think 2 more states act on it, yes, but I don't think in the states, yes, because the states don't mind, the people in the states don't mind tying the hands of the federal government, but I don't believe we'll get it through Congress simply because it's unrealistic. You can't ask this Congress and this government to tie the hands of future governments when there are emergencies yet unforeseen that a president will need to act on with the same flexibility that Ronald Reagan has had the last 4 years. It would be a very hypocritical and potentially harmful thing for them to do.
The scene you are seeing is Statuary Hall in the capital of the United States. The post-inaugural luncheon, which follows the swearing-in ceremony, Supreme Court justices, diplomats, the cabinet, congressional leaders, and 6 just plain folks invited by Senator Charles Mathias, the chair of the Joint Congressional Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies, will be attending this post-inaugural lunch. And Bob Schieffer, you were reminding me earlier that the last time we had an inauguration, the great story was the hostages, and it was at this luncheon, the post-inaugural luncheon, that it was announced that the hostages would be leaving Iran.
And Ronald Reagan said, that makes it a perfect day.
Shows you, demonstrates once again to me how ephemeral headlines are, because the hostages were the great headlines, and now you rarely hear anyone even discuss the hostage story.
No, but it's a symptom, I think, of how much the national mood has changed, and the Americans felt so ashamed over that. I think that's really what contributed to President Reagan's landslide win over Jimmy Carter 4 years ago. And whatever else you can say about the first Reagan term, there's a kind of national pride that's come back. Nobody talks about the hostages, and nobody feels any need to. And when he says that he's brought America back, in a sense he has. You know, people feel better about the place than they used to.
Well, Bill Moyers, when President Johnson won his great electoral victory in 1964 and was sworn in for a second time in 1965, I know how many of us said, and I include myself in this, well, it's pretty predictable what Lyndon Johnson is going to do. And we've said this about Ronald Reagan's second term, but as I recall it, we were wrong about a lot because there's so much unexpected happens. What we expect seldom really occurs.
Well, the high resolve of presidents at high noon on inaugural day often gets ground up by the realities of the morning after. Lyndon Johnson promised peace and took us to war in Vietnam. Richard Nixon promised law and order and almost stole the Constitution. One of the reasons that Ronald Reagan is popular today is that on the whole he has done what in that inaugural address 4 years ago he said he would do. He has cut the tax rate. He has increased defense spending. He has trimmed the rate of growth in domestic spending. He's made the presidency function again. He's brought back a sense of optimism, as people said. He does believe in the gross national psychology, thinks it's as important in many respects as the gross national product. And unlike most presidents in the last 20 years, he has performed more closely to what his agenda held out when he took office than any other president. And I think that, as well as and in particular, the cutting of the rate of inflation, are responsible for Ronald Reagan's very high popularity today.
Speaker O'Neill has entered Statuary Hall and is going to the head table as the post-inaugural luncheon
Ladies and gentlemen,
to form up.
the Vice President and Mrs. Bush.
Vice President and Mrs. Bush entering the hall, complete with the statues of heroes from all 50 states. Bill Moyers, as we watch this continuing part of the ritual.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Reagan.
Seated to Mrs. Reagan's left, Senator Mathias, for those of you who perhaps have not been with us through the whole ceremony. We mentioned this Statuary Hall had the heroes of the 50 states. Statuary Hall is named for the idea that we're going to have statues of heroic figures from all 50 states. However, and they do have representatives of all 50 states in statue form in the hall, but some of them had to be placed outside the hall because the very weight of the statues, as the number of states increased, threatened to crash the floor in. And the underpinning of the Capitol simply wouldn't support it. So, for example, one of my own favorites, Stephen F. Austin, his statue is just outside the hall there.
It's a wonderful miscellany. I mean, you've got politicians and authors. Lew Wallace, the man who wrote Ben-Hur, is in there. Huey Long from Louisiana. You know, just all sorts of people.
That's a good story, Bruce, that someone was saying that this man, Lew Wallace, his statue is in Statuary Hall in the capital of the United States, and somebody said, well, this guy was a very bad Civil War general. What's his statue doing? He said, well, he was a bad Civil War general, but he went home and wrote Ben-Hur. And that's the reason he's
sold real well.
But it's easy to make fun, and it's part of being an American, to make fun of ourselves, even on our most solemn occasions. But such occasions, what we once called, I think, connective rituals, do have an important place in our society. And Bill Moyers, I know this is one of your favorite subjects, and while the President and Vice President and the Mrs. Reagan and Mrs. Bush and the honored guests begin their lunch, perhaps we should talk about it for a moment. Yes, it's expensive, and yes, it's a show, but it's also a very important part of the fabric of the country, isn't it?
It most certainly is. I happen to believe that myths are important to a nation, that ritual and ceremony tie us to the past and point us toward the future. They sometimes invent the past in ways suitable to the rich imagination of a people who don't like to be anchored very much in the reality of the past. But Bill Luchtenberg is here with me, a historian from the University of North Carolina who studied the presidency, studied our history this century. What role do you think ceremony and myth play in a democracy?
Well, I think what I'm most struck by is the degree to which Ronald Reagan, in this address today, kept bringing us back to the past and sounded themes that we've heard before. Indeed, to such an extent, this was so 19th century an address that it could have been given by William McKinley. He quoted this time not FDR or any other 20th century figure, but people like John Adams and Jefferson, and he spoke in the language of Protestant evangelicalism, the hope for the future, a sense not just of renewal, but even of resurrection, using the imagery of movement from darkness into light. And when he did very briefly talk about the 20th century, he talked about the century showing the march of progress, the growth of human liberty. I think to any historian of the 20th century, that comes as an astonishing kind of revelation.
Is history a ribbon?
I think he had a little trouble with his metaphors in that sense.
Dr. Barbara Kellerman is a political scientist from the Institute for Leadership Studies at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey, just written a book on presidential leadership. What about President Reagan's calls to the nation to patriotism? He doesn't really ask us as an act of leadership to sacrifice very much, does he?
No, he seems to promise all without asking very much of us, and I might point out that's in stark contrast to his immediate predecessor, so that Carter, for example, constantly asked us to sacrifice, to give up. He was, in his rhetoric, relatively punitive. He talked about a malaise that overcame the country. And so Ronald Reagan has the distinction not only of promising us all without requesting very much from us, but coming at a time where his predecessor really was an extreme opposite. It seems a particular pleasure. Let me just say one other thing in this regard, which is another kind of background than the one Bill just referred to, and that's his Hollywood background, which I think is not irrelevant here. It's a little like the old-fashioned movie, where you were promised a happy ending no matter what your performance in the interim, and I think Ronald Reagan harks as much back to that part of himself as to the earlier parts of American history.
Thank you both, Bill Luchtenberg, Barbara Kellerman. Dan?
Thank you, Bill. Bob Schieffer and Bruce Morton, I don't know what your favorite place in the Capitol is. This statuary hall where this post-inaugural luncheon is being held may be mine.
Well, it's certainly one of the most popular stops for visitors who come to Washington, because it used to be the old House chamber originally, and it has the trick acoustics. If you've been on the House tour, you remember there's a certain spot in there that you can go and you can whisper, and people 30 feet away can hear you whispering, and that used to cause some problems during the time that was a House chamber, because one party would hear what the other one was talking about. They couldn't figure out how they knew what the strategy was. So tourists to the Capitol always get a big kick out of that.
Well, also you pass the brooding face of Brigham Young, for example, a smiling face of Sam Houston. It's got to be one of the more popular places on the Capitol tour. But Bruce, when you were working over there, you spent most of your time, I suppose, in the press gallery, not in Statuary Hall.
Well, everybody likes Statuary Hall, you know. They change the folks there every once in a while. There used to be a wonderful Indian chief from Hawaii, for instance, who's not there anymore.
He got moved on the outside.
Got moved on the outside because, as you said, it can't hold them all. But it's a wonderful building because it's full of little nooks and crannies that nobody knows about. There's unless they've taken it out in the last few years, a spiral staircase there, and old-timers used to insist, I never knew whether this was true or not, that the marks on the walls were where the British had fired musket balls during the War of 1812, you know, and it's just full of history.
And our CBS News coverage of this historic day will continue after these messages. Well, behind us, the west front of the Capitol. You can see it again now, and under our Now You See It, Now You Don't live coverage from the East Building of the National Gallery. Inside in Statuary Hall, lunch is being served at the moment, the post-inaugural lunch. The luncheon toast will take place after a while under a painting by Francis Cropsey, Autumn on the Hudson River. 1860 painting on loan from the National Gallery. The parade has been canceled because of the bitter cold, the coldest inauguration day on record, 4 below zero in Washington, D.C. overnight. It slowly warmed up, and our thermometer at last look was showing about 7 degrees above and rising, but the parade has been canceled. In its place at the Capitol Center. This is in Landover, Maryland, in suburban Washington. They're already rehearsing. This is a tribute. It's not going to be called a pageant. They toyed to that word, but they're going to be called a tribute. And so later this afternoon, the President and Mrs. Reagan are scheduled to go over. This is inside at the Capitol Center. This is the great sports arena built by a genuine American character and a great community civic-minded citizen here in Washington, Abe Holland. The President and Mrs. Reagan and the official party will be guests there. Will come in and see some of what they would have seen had the parade taken place. Now, that's what will be happening this afternoon, about mid-afternoon, Washington time, and we'll, of course, be here for the coverage of that. There may be thousands fewer frozen faces around Washington because of the cancellation of the inaugural parade, but as Bernard Goldberg now reports, there are a lot of sad young faces around town, too.
How cold is it? Cold enough to break some hearts. They're just 37 high school kids from a small town in Middle America. 37 high school kids from Tampico, Illinois, the very same Tampico, Illinois, where Ronald Reagan was born 73 years ago. They were just 37 kids with one dream, to march down Pennsylvania Avenue, to march right in front of the president who came from the same place they did. It was supposed to be their once-in-a-lifetime performance. But last night in Washington, they got the news.
It's no one's fault about the weather or anything. Can't do anything about it. But President Reagan will never be reelected. And we will never be in high school again in 4 years. For Tampico, it was just such a big excitement for a little town like that. And, you know, it's just like a bubble and it just got burst.
Last night, they played for some visitors from Illinois. It wasn't Pennsylvania Avenue, and it wasn't always easy.
I'm a little depressed because I was really looking forward to this. It's about the biggest thing that's really ever happened to our band, and I really can't believe they did this, canceled it and everything, but I guess that's how it goes.
Back to regular old schedule, working on for, we'll have a spring concert coming up, and go back to regular old normal life.
Since I'm the majorette, the whistle would stick to my lips, and they would bleed, but we got through it. In the snow, we practiced as it was snowing and in the ice, out in the country roads with the wind. It was a lot of hard work, but we would have done well.
It was pretty cold back in Tampico when they practiced in the snow. Sometimes it was bitter cold, but it was never cold enough to break some hearts. This is Bernard Goldberg.
I'm so sorry the parade didn't take place. I mean, and that's the reason, but that's what the country's about. You know, these young people and others who hoped and dreamed and competed, tried their best at chili suppers and pizza sales all over the country to get themselves here. And tough moment when the parade gets canceled. I don't think anybody would argue with the decision as cold as it got last night. But you have to say to yourself, well, it's that kind of individual spirit that made the country, not commentators, anchor men, would-be potentates and politicians and all the so-called high and mighty. That's what this country's about.
Well, and what we want to remember is that only the Washington part of this parade was really canceled, because this parade doesn't form up down here on Independence Avenue. It starts in hundreds of towns across the country just like that. Daniel Borstein, the Librarian of Congress, said this morning that what sets a democracy apart is that people may vote against the leader, but then they support him, and that's really what all this is all about. Maybe half the kids in that band, maybe their parents voted for Walter Mondale, but yet this was the inauguration of the president, and they wanted to be here.
Well, it's a sense of celebration, of course, but you do have to feel sad for the kids. There's a young man, the Washington, D.C. band is from Eastern High School, which is just about 20 blocks down the road there, and I remember his saying, you know, to march for the president is an honor and a privilege that I'll remember all my life. And of course, you know, he's lost that.
Well, you say, well, celebration of what? Among other things, the reason that honor and a privilege and people feel that way is that we haven't forgotten, in our better moments, we haven't forgotten what a new thing in history it was and a new thing in history it still is. To have a system in which you compete, one person, one vote election. When it's over, you say, okay, peaceful, tranquil transition of power, handing the power either to a new party, a new president, or to the one we had before, and everybody, once the election over, falls in behind and says, well, he's not my guy, he's not the fellow I voted for, but it's our country, he's our leader, and now he's swinging behind him. That's what this was all about.
Exactly. It doesn't work in very many places. You know, we forget how special it is. There are just a handful of countries in the world that have been able to do that.
Never in the history of this country, when a president has lost, has there been any doubt that he would leave office, nor when a president was elected that there was any doubt that he would assume the office. This country in the Civil War held elections. What other country in the history of the world held an election in the midst of a civil war? This country was the only country during World War II of the Western democracies that held elections. We take it for granted.
And on the other hand, as the rabbi said in his prayer earlier, we've fought throughout our history the temptation and how large a temptation it is to be guilty of arrogance and false pride. That it is something you have to earn every day, every year, and something you can't take for granted. There are differences between our system and that of others, but this is our celebration. This, as the President said today in his second inaugural address, this is our song. And for the moment, this is our coverage. We're going to be leaving the air here very shortly to rejoin the tribute at the Capitol Center at about 2 hours from now. So an inaugural replay ceremony, complete with hairpin turns and plans and skids on the ice and cruel and unusual cold, is over. A fitting American mixture of high hopes and disappointments. That graceful glide from one presidential term to another. The sudden bitter coming of winter to Washington, the big chill outside, and the president's call for a federal budget freeze everywhere. None of that with us, or I'm sure with you, diminishes for a moment at least our silent singing of that patriotic hymn that goes, "Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light." For CBS News, Dan Rather. We'll see you a little later on.
Reporting from the East Building of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, here is Dan Rather.
Good afternoon. From record-breaking, bone-chilling, deep-biting, bitter cold Washington, just 13 degrees now. The overnight low in Washington, D.C. was -4. Nonetheless, there'll be a hot time in the old town after all, but only indoors. It froze on Ronald Reagan's parade and our parade, but the show, in some respects, does go on. And it will go on in Landover, Maryland at the Capitol Center. That's just a few miles away, but many degrees hotter than outside our location here at the East Building of the National Gallery. It's still red, white, and brr out there. President and Nancy Reagan will be arriving at the Capitol Center in a short while as the festivities at the Capitol Center have been underway since about 12:30. This is a kind of makeup as best as can be arranged for the cancellation of the inaugural parade. What you see here is a helicopter that has just arrived at the Capitol Center in suburban Washington. That we're told was a staff helicopter for the staff. The president's own helicopter is expected to be along very shortly. Bob Schieffer is with me here. Charles Carrault and Leslie Stahl are at the Capitol Center. I think one of the things we want to point out to you is that the Capitol Center, which was privately financed and built, we mentioned earlier, Abe Pollan, civic-minded citizen of the Washington-Baltimore area, built it as a home for the Washington Bullets basketball team. The local hockey team is out there. It's now the home court for the Georgetown Hoyas basketball team. Boxing has been held there, rodeos, other events. Unlike all of the public buildings in the Capitol itself, the Capitol Center is privately financed and run. Of course, it is a community asset and has tax breaks and that sort of thing, but it's a success story in its own right in that it was originally built for something over $18 million, and individual Americans stuck their necks out and invested in it and trying to make that investment come out. However, for this afternoon's purposes, it's indoors and large enough to seat quite a few of the disappointed people that will not be taking part in the inaugural parade that had been scheduled for this afternoon but was called off. Now, we are now told that the President is speaking at the Capitol Center.
Any of the ceremony at the Capitol, but as I say, transcending politics was this feeling of a country together, and the Senate did itself proud in innovating in under very short order, bringing a marvelous ceremony to the attention of the American people and indeed worldwide. So thanks for all you're doing. Thanks for what you've done. My only regret is we didn't get to sit in that reviewing stand and see the majesty of the parade, but I think in a sense we understand certainly what it is that you brought here. Thank you all very much. In just a minute, the President will be here.
Well, clearly, it's not a case of your correspondent's eyes are going, but that was Vice President Bush speaking at the Capitol Center. And also, the President's helicopter has arrived at Landover, Maryland. That our ability to see what's happening out there is not as clear as it might be. And while the President's staff helicopter arrived a few minutes before we went on the air, the President's helicopter, that was it. We had a shot of a moment ago. We also had a brief glimpse of President Reagan going into the Capitol Center. He's now in a holding room. Vice President Bush and Mrs. Bush are taking their bows and waving to the crowd. That sign Mrs. Bush is giving is a hook 'em horn sign, which sports fans will recognize as supporters of the University of Texas Longhorns give a hook 'em horn sign. Vice President Bush giving his more familiar thumbs up sign. And we now have our communications all squared away, and so we don't have any more cases of misidentifying helicopters. And let's go directly to the Capitol Center, where Charles Kuralt and Leslie Stahl are standing by to help us describe this afternoon's tribute to those who had been scheduled to take part in the inaugural parade. Good afternoon, Leslie and Charles.
Good afternoon, Dan. I must tell you right off the bat that I'm having this strange sense of deja vu. This is just like the campaign rallies the president had at the end of the campaign when he went around to college campuses and high schools. Same kind of look, red, white, and blue, a lot of patriotic music. What we have here really are mostly the bands that we're going to march in front of the White House today, about 50 of them, here in the Capitol Center. However, they're not going to be playing for the president. Only one of those bands will be playing. About 650 college students brought together in what they call the All-American Marching Band, brought in from 40 different colleges. But the audience is the other bands. It's a convention of bands, really.
And there's nothing quite so sad, Dan, as 8,000 high school band musicians without their instruments. Most of them came here expecting to be the show,
Ladies
of course, and now they're merely attending a show. They're introducing special guests down there now, Dan.
They're introducing the chairman of the inaugural committee. Dan, they put this together last night in the middle of the night. I'm told about 4 a.m. they decided that this would be the place. It's one of the largest indoor stadiums, whatever, in the area. And as somebody said right before we came on the air, because the bands couldn't come to the president is coming to the bands. And here he is coming into the hall right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Reagan.
Can we move back a little, please? Move back, please.
What you're about to see now are band musicians from 40 colleges and universities around the country. It's quite a big band. It was put together by the inaugural committee. I counted, and there are, for example, 40 tubas in this band. This was to have been the finale of the parade, but that's been canceled.
Charlie, it's a part of the Reagan administration's attempt to attract young people. The emphasis in the parade, in fact, was supposed to be on young people. You know that 60% of college kids in the country voted for President Reagan in the election.
Charles and Leslie, since this is one of the few times we will have to hear the bands, when they strike up the music, let's listen to it.
I'm with you. We've been listening to them rehearse, and they're just one.
Ladies and gentlemen, the band now presents the music of America.
Live from the Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland, the tribute to the inaugural parade that wasn't with Leslie Stahl and Charles Perrault. What can you say other than for what it was a Sacco performance?
You know, one thing that occurs to me, Dan, is that it shows something about where power lies in this country. Normally, a band would face the president in serenading him. They couldn't both face him and the television cameras, so they chose to face the television cameras. The president had the worst seat in the house for that little concert.
Did you notice, Dan, that through the whole concert he and Mrs. Reagan held hands?
And now, ladies and gentlemen,
Did indeed.
introducing the chairman of the 50th American...
Leslie Stahl, one thing occurs to me. This is called the All-American College Marching Band and the inaugural entertainment company, but in effect, what the inaugural committee is doing and the Republican committee that behind the inaugural committee is they're putting on their show, their part of the parade, and everybody else is blocked out.
That's correct. These are, as we were saying before, just the people who are going to be in the parade. I really think it's an attempt to assuage some of the disappointed feelings of these young people. There were so many high school bands here. I know both Charlie and I spoke to a couple of the young people here today, and I spoke to one girl in a band from Minnesota who said that they had spent all yesterday trying to figure out how to cope with the cold. They had gotten some antifreeze, some non-toxic antifreeze to put in their instruments so that they wouldn't freeze, and they really thought they had it licked, and they're really feeling quite badly. And I know, Charlie, you spoke to some people, too.
Nancy Reagan is stepping to the microphone now. This isn't in the schedule.
I just wanted to tell you how disappointed we were, and I know how disappointed you were, and thousands of people who were hoping and waiting to see you in the parade. And hearing you here, as Ron said, how wonderful it would have been. I know how hard you worked and how long you worked, and I wish it could have been different, but you wouldn't have liked frostbite. So thank you very much for letting us come out here and hear you and see you and tell you in person how sorry we are. And I do thank all of you for all your work and everything that you've done. You've just been wonderful, and you are wonderful, and we love you.
You scared me.
I forgot something. I was supposed to introduce my roommate. Who happens to be my husband, who happens to be the President of the United States.
How could you have forgotten me? Well, good afternoon. I'm told that this is the coldest day in inauguration history. But looking out at all of you, I somehow feel there's a lot of warmth inside this building. Who would ever thought that I'd be the one standing up and talking while all of you were, well, almost all of you were sitting down and listening? It just goes to show here in Washington, things have a way of turning out the opposite of how we intend. I know you didn't get your chance to salute all of us, but I just want you to know how happy and how important it was for Nancy, myself, and the Vice President and Mrs. Bush to come here to salute all of you. You know, whether we and all America were so looking forward to seeing each one of you perform and delight us with your wonderful talents and exuberance, and what a great American family you are. Because whether you come from as far away as Hawaii, California, Texas, Florida, New York or Mississippi or Washington or Alaska. Where I'm told the team from Alaska was the only one that came here and really was and could have gone through with the parade, because they came with a team of Huskies, and I can't go on naming all your states, because I know all 50 are represented here, and the territories, and you represent America at its best. And you would have given America the greatest show on earth. Now, we were all anticipating the parade, and I was looking forward to every unit. I'd heard about all of you, and particularly there was one at someplace in here, I think, is a band from my home, or the town where I was born, Tampico, Illinois. And with that band was going to be the pom-pom girls from the high school, Dixon, Illinois, where I graduated. I want to tell you, I have a little knowledge and understanding of some of your problems. I was the drum major of the Dixon YMCA Boys Band, and we were... I had a brief career because we were asked to head up the parade in a nearby town on Decoration Day. And I know that everyone was briefed about the parade course and everything, but I had also been told that a fellow on a white horse was going to be out in front, and I figured I'll just follow the man on the white horse. Who can go wrong doing that? And I was going down the street making with the baton, and pretty soon I thought the music was beginning to sound a little faint. I looked over my shoulder. Everybody turned a corner. I was going down the wrong street all by myself. I kept right on walking, right out of a musical career. Well, we know the tremendous time and personal dedication that each of you put into your preparations. Everything from bake sales to getting church and civic groups to help you raise the money to pay your way, to the long, long hours of rehearsal so that you perform at your very best. And I don't want to forget to mention one other very important group of participants who are here with us too, our United States military personnel. You know, all of them and most of you are about pretty much the same age group. And I just want to say something. Back in World War II, General George Marshall was asked by someone what he thought was our secret weapon. And General Marshall said, the best damn kids in the world. And you know something? If he were here today, he could say the same thing, because you are. Led by our military, led by Paul Miller, the Director of Ceremonies and Special Events for the Military District of Washington, Deputy Parade Chairman, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Frank Turner. They were a tremendously effective organizational team, and they would have been there to line your parade route down Pennsylvania Avenue. And let me tell you, I and all of us up here, George and Barbara and Nancy, we were raring to go. I went searching into the closet. I had a pair of long johns. I was going to put them on. Last time I wore them was in the 1980 primary campaign in New Hampshire. But it would have been a magical moment to tuck away and cherish with your loved ones during all your later years. But it was not to be. And I just hope you understand that we only made this decision after we were convinced that it was absolutely necessary to protect your own health as well as the health of the thousands who would be lining the parade to watch you. Believe me, we had professional medical advice in making that decision. But I pledge one thing to all of you today, and that is to serve with the very best of my abilities and to try during these next 4 years to live up to the spirit, unity, and pride that you have brought to Washington, because that's what makes America the greatest country on earth. There's another thought that I'd like to leave with you, and that is that your trip here, despite the cancellation of the parade, is still very worthwhile and important. Because all of us together have been participants in a great miracle of modern history, the simple, peaceful continuation of power ratifying the sovereignty of we the people. There has never been a transfer of power by bayonet in America, and God willing, there never will be. Thomas Jefferson once said, "How little do my countrymen know what precious blessings they are in possession of, and which no other people on earth enjoy." Well, today we can rejoice that more and more people on earth are moving toward democracy, and we can rejoice that America, a nation still young compared to so many others, is the oldest, most successful republic on earth. In 2 years, we will celebrate together the 200th anniversary of our Constitution. And what a day that will be for parades, not only in Washington, D.C., but all across our land. So, while we could not go through with today's festivities, we can celebrate in our hearts the continuation of this wonderful experiment in individual liberty and self-government. And we can give thanks that we remain today, as Abraham Lincoln said over 100 years ago, the last best hope of man on earth. God bless you all. Thank you all again. Have a safe journey home. Thank you.
Mr. President and Mr. Vice President, we now present the grand finale to your inaugural parade. This is the one we had hoped to do for you on Pennsylvania Avenue. Only now, you're riding on our finale float.
Live from the Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland, just outside the nation's capital, our CBS News coverage of the tribute to the inaugural parade that wasn't will continue in a moment.
There's more for your life at Sears.
If you think you know Sears catalog, wait till you see this. Sears new spring catalog is hot and cool. Not at all the catalog your mother knew. See what I mean? It's smart, daring, sassy. Yes, it's Sears catalog. Let the color splash. We're afraid of nothing, just like you. It's amazing what a touch here and there can do, and Sears catalog does it. Come on, confess. These are looks you can't resist. And why should you?
Sears new spring catalog is yours for only $4. Get your copy at your Sears store or call our toll-free number.
Sears catalog is so easy to use, you probably will. Again and again.
Can it be Sears catalog?
Can it be? Believe it.
There's more for your life at Sears.
I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. And when many adults get a cough, they play doctor at home. They treat their cough with the same medicine they originally bought for their children. They need one of the adult formulas from Vicks for the coughs adults get with the strength adults need. Formula 44 for coughs, 44D for coughs with congestion, and now Formula 44M for coughs with congestion and a raw, irritated throat. The adult formulas. You can't buy anything more effective.
The adult formulas, from Vicks, of course.
People get a lot of fish out of these waters, and some company gets a lot of oil. Over 3 million barrels a year. We know that sea life was here long before we were. This is the drill. That's why we have practice drills like this. In case of a spill, our containment unit would quickly surround the oil and help prevent damage. At Sun, we think putting our energy back into the environment is as important as getting it out.
Where there's sun, there's energy.
Well, the tribute to those who were to have taken part in the now canceled inaugural parade goes on at Landover, Maryland, just outside the nation's capital, where President and Mrs. Reagan, along with Vice President and Mrs. Bush, came and greeted those so many disappointed, particularly young people who came to Washington for a parade that simply was not to be. And so the end of a much abbreviated inaugural day celebration here in very cold Washington, as it is cold in many other parts of the country. The best laid plans of presidents and networks, parade givers and parade watchers had to simply be placed on ice, proving once again that there's only one thing that most Americans like better than a good parade, and that's having good common sense and sense enough to know when to come in out of the cold. It's a good day for constitutional government and a good day for earmuffs. And for Charlie Carrault, Leslie Stahl, Bob Schieffer, and for all of my CBS News colleagues, until the CBS Evening News later tonight, Dan Rather in Washington, good afternoon.
This has been a CBS News special report, an inaugural tribute to the President. This portion was sponsored by Dinner Classics from Armour. The frozen dinners so good they belong in the dining room. By Anacin, more medicine, no more headache. And by Frito-Lay, who is proud to be a sponsor of the 50th presidential inauguration. This is CBS.